History is often viewed as a series of grand battles, but the dissolution of Napoleon Bonaparte's empire was actually the result of the most expensive administrative failure ever recorded. By the time the dust settled on the 19th century, the French emperor had orchestrated a geopolitical catastrophe that, in modern terms, represents a $100 billion liquidation of human and financial capital. This was not a story of bad luck on the battlefield. It was a forensic case study in how a brilliant military mind can be completely dismantled by the invisible laws of supply and demand. Napoleon attempted to perform a hostile takeover of the entire European market, believing he could bankrupt his enemies by simply closing the doors to their shop. He viewed the British economy as a fragile bubble that would burst if he severed its connection to continental consumers. But as the French emperor signed the Berlin Decree, he failed to realize that he was not just locking his enemy out. He was locking himself into a room that was rapidly running out of oxygen. The math was simple, the execution was cold, but the variable he ignored was about to turn his own soldiers into the best customers of the very enemy he was trying to starve. To understand the scale of this mismanagement, one must view the First French Empire not as a nation, but as a sprawling conglomerate attempting to monopolize the European logistics sector. Napoleon's primary objective was to secure a permanent competitive advantage by liquidating the British credit system. He recognized that the British treasury was the venture capitalist behind every coalition formed against him. By cutting off the flow of British exports, he intended to trigger a liquidity crisis that would force a total surrender. This was a high-stakes gamble on a macroeconomic scale, requiring absolute compliance from every port from the Baltic to the Mediterranean. However, the emperor failed to account for the fact that a market without competition is a market that eventually stops producing value. The logic of the Continental System rested on the assumption that Europe was a self-sustaining economic unit that could thrive behind a protectionist wall. Napoleon believed he could pivot the entire continent as trade routes toward Paris, effectively making France the sole clearinghouse for all European commerce. This was a classic case of executive overreach, where the CEO ignores the operational realities of his subsidiaries in favor of a centralized vision. The British, meanwhile, were operating on a global scale, utilizing their naval dominance to secure new markets in the Americas and Asia. While Napoleon was trying to corner the European market, his rivals were diversifying their portfolio and preparing for a long-term war of attrition. This fundamental asymmetry in market access meant that the French blockade was actually a self-imposed embargo on innovation and capital. The Berlin Decree of 1806 served as the formal prospectus for Napoleon's plan to weaponize the geography of Europe against the British pound. By declaring the British Isles to be in a state of blockade, he sought to create a monetary iron curtain that would isolate London from its primary source of revenue. Every vessel coming directly from a British port was to be seized, and all British-made goods were classified as contraband subject to immediate confiscation. This was not merely a military order. It was a radical restructuring of a European supply chain designed to favor French manufacturers. Napoleon assumed that the sheer size of the continental market would allow it to dictate terms to the global economy. Yet, the immediate result was not a British collapse, but a sudden and violent contraction of the very markets Napoleon claimed to be protecting. For the merchants of Hamburg, Amsterdam, and Lisbon, the Continental System represented a massive asset write-off that threatened their solvency overnight. These trade hubs had spent centuries building the infrastructure of global commerce, only to find their warehouses locked by French customs officials. The opportunity cost of this policy was staggering, as capital that should have been reinvested in trade was instead diverted to pay for the massive administrative overhead of enforcement. Local economies began to stagnate, deprived of the raw materials and finished goods that fueled their domestic industries. Napoleon's response to these complaints was to tighten the screws, treating economic dissent as a form of corporate treason. But as the shelves grew empty, the demand for British goods did not disappear. It simply went underground where the French state could no longer tax it. The artificial scarcity created by the blockade led to a period of hyperinflation that crippled the European middle class. Commodities like sugar, coffee, and cotton, which had become essential staples of 19th century life, saw their prices skyrocket as legal imports vanished. This was a classic supply shock, where the state-mandated reduction in inventory led to a total breakdown of price stability. French industry was expected to fill this void, but it lacked the technological sophistication and the economies of scale that the British had perfected during the Industrial Revolution. Instead of a vibrant internal market, the Continental System produced a series of fragmented, inefficient monopolies that relied on state subsidies to survive. The emperor was essentially subsidizing failure while punishing the most productive sectors of his empire. This internal rot was the first sign that the hostile takeover was failing to generate the expected dividends. To maintain the integrity of his closed-loop system, Napoleon was forced to expand his military footprint to every corner of the continent. Every mile of coastline that remained open to British trade was a leak in his balance sheet that had to be plugged with expensive military garrisons. This meant that the profitability of the Continental System was constantly being eroded by the rising costs of its own defense. Napoleon found himself in a cycle of diminishing returns, where each new conquest added more liabilities than assets to his imperial ledger. He was no longer just a general. He was a debt collector trying to enforce a contract that his partners were desperate to break. The strain of this enforcement was about to push the French Empire toward a series of high-risk acquisitions that would ultimately lead to its total liquidation. As the official economy collapsed, a shadow market emerged that functioned with far greater efficiency than the French administration. Smuggling became the most lucrative industry in Europe, offering massive arbitrage opportunities for anyone willing to bypass Napoleon's customs agents. The price differential between a bale of British cotton in London and the same bale in Paris was high enough to justify extreme risks. This black market acted as a pressure valve, allowing some goods to flow into the continent, but at a cost that the French state could never recover. Napoleon's attempt to control the flow of capital only succeeded in incentivizing the most creative forms of logistics. This pervasive corruption meant that the blockade was less like a wall and more like a sieve, leaking capital into the hands of a very specific offshore competitor. The British response to the blockade was a masterclass in logistics and market penetration, centered on the tiny island of Heligoland. Located off the German coast, this rocky outcrop was transformed into a massive distribution hub for British exports. From this secure offshore facility, goods were funneled into the continent through a network of local agents and corrupt French officials. The British were essentially running a high-volume, low-margin wholesale operation that bypassed every tariff and restriction Napoleon could devise. While the French spent millions trying to patrol the beaches, the British were quietly monetizing the very scarcity the blockade was designed to create. This logistical bypass ensured that the British economy remained liquid while the French treasury slowly bled dry from the inside out. Perhaps the most damning evidence of the system's failure was the greatcoat hypocrisy that permeated the French military. Despite his rhetoric of economic self-sufficiency, Napoleon's own industrial base was so underdeveloped that it could not provide basic equipment for his soldiers. When the Grand Army marched toward the east, thousands of French troops were actually wearing boots and wool greatcoats manufactured in the factories of Yorkshire. The French government was forced to grant secret licenses to import these essential goods from their sworn enemy, because the domestic supply chain had collapsed. Napoleon was effectively funding the British war machine with French gold just to keep his own men from freezing. This cognitive dissonance between policy and reality was a clear indicator of a failing corporate strategy. The emperor's refusal to acknowledge these failures led him directly into the sunk cost fallacy, where he continued to invest blood and treasure into a broken system. Instead of pivoting toward a more sustainable trade policy he doubled down on enforcement, believing that total control was just one more conquest away. He viewed every hole in the blockade as a personal insult rather than a market signal that his policy was fundamentally flawed. This obsession with compliance led to the disastrous occupation of Spain and Portugal, which turned into a massive drain on French resources. The Spanish ulcer was a direct consequence of trying to force a sovereign nation to participate in an economic suicide pact. This strategic blindness ensured that his empire would eventually reach a point of total insolvency. By 1811, the Continental System had reached its breaking point, and the most important partner in the conglomerate was looking for an exit strategy. Tsar Alexander I of Russia realized that his nation's economy was being sacrificed to satisfy Napoleon's obsession with destroying London. The Russian ruble was in free fall, and the domestic nobility was on the verge of revolt due to the loss of British markets for their grain and timber. When Russia finally decided to reopen its ports to British trade, it was not just a policy change. It was a formal declaration of economic independence. Napoleon viewed this move as a breach of contract that required a massive, aggressive acquisition to rectify. He prepared to lead the largest army in human history across the border, unaware that he was about to initiate the final, catastrophic liquidation of his entire empire. The 1812 campaign was never intended to be a war of conquest. It was the largest armed audit in human history. Napoleon marched into Russia to force a compliance that the market was no longer willing to provide. He believed that by seizing Moscow, he was capturing the central bank of the Russian soul, forcing the Tsar to settle his debts and return to the blockade. But as the first French scouts entered the city, they realized that the Russians had pioneered a new form of economic warfare, total asset destruction. The fire that consumed Moscow was a signal that the Tsar had opted for a scorched earth bankruptcy rather than a French-mandated reorganization. Napoleon was now holding a burning asset with no liquidity and a supply chain that stretched across a frozen wasteland. The cost of maintaining this position was about to exceed the total valuation of his entire empire. This refusal to trade meant that every day the French remained in Moscow, their net worth was evaporating in the Russian winter. The logistical failure of the Russian campaign was fundamentally a failure of inventory management on a continental scale. Napoleon's supply lines were stretched so thin that the lead time for basic provisions became unsustainable for a force of 500,000 men. While the French army was accustomed to requisitioning supplies from local populations, the Russian interior offered nothing but empty fields and charred ruins. This lack of local liquidity meant that the Grand Army was forced to carry its own entire operational budget in the form of massive, slow-moving supply wagons. These wagons became easy targets for partisan raids, further depleting the army's available resources before they even reached the front lines. The emperor had ignored the basic principle that a business cannot operate if its overhead exceeds its daily revenue. This logistical insolvency created a situation where the army was essentially consuming itself just to stay in motion. The retreat from Moscow was not a tactical withdrawal. It was a desperate liquidation sale of the most powerful military force ever assembled. As the temperature dropped, the Grand Army began to shed its capital assets in a frantic attempt to maintain a minimum level of mobility. Thousands of horses, the high-performance engines of 19th century logistics, were slaughtered for food or left to die on the frozen tracks. Heavy artillery pieces, representing massive state investments in industrial manufacturing, were abandoned in the snow to prevent them from slowing the pace of the retreat. Even the gold and treasures looted from Moscow were discarded as the weight of survival began to outstrip the market value of the currency. The French soldiers were no longer a disciplined workforce. They were starving shareholders trying to salvage whatever physical capital they could carry. This rapid divestment of military hardware signaled the end of France's status as a dominant continental power. By the time the remnants of the army crossed the Berezina River, The scale of the human capital loss was unprecedented in the history of corporate warfare. Napoleon had entered Russia with over 600,000 men, a diverse labor force recruited from across the continent to maintain his monopoly. He returned with barely a fraction of that number, having lost nearly 90% of his specialized workforce in a single fiscal quarter. These were not just soldiers, but experienced middle managers and technical specialists whose loss could not be easily replaced by new recruitment drives. The sheer scale of this brain drain meant that the French military machine had lost its institutional memory and its operational edge. The emperor's reputation as a reliable manager of risk was shattered, leaving his remaining allies to question the long-term viability of the Napoleonic brand. This massive workforce contraction was the catalyst for a hostile takeover attempt by the rest of Europe. While Napoleon was struggling with a depleted labor pool, the British were deploying their most effective weapon, the Cavalry of St. George. This was a nickname given to the massive gold subsidies that the British treasury funneled into the coffers of Prussia, Austria, and Russia. London acted as the ultimate venture capitalist, providing the liquidity necessary for these nations to rebuild their own armies and challenge French hegemony. British credit was the engine of the Sixth Coalition, allowing Napoleon's rivals to scale their operations faster than the French could recover. The British government was willing to take on massive debt to fund this project, betting that the eventual reopening of European markets would provide a sufficient return on investment. This infinite liquidity meant that every time Napoleon won a tactical victory, his enemies simply refinanced and returned to the field. The French emperor was now fighting against a global financial system that had decided he was no longer a creditworthy partner. The British success was predicated on their ability to manage a debt-to-GDP ratio that would have terrified any other 19th century government. While Napoleon was forced to fund his wars through direct taxation and the looting of conquered territories, the British utilized a sophisticated bond market to leverage their future earnings. This allowed them to sustain a level of military spending that far outstripped their immediate tax receipts. The British public, confident in the eventual return on their investment, continued to buy government debt even in the darkest hours of the conflict. This deep pool of domestic capital provided the British treasury with a strategic depth that the French could never match. Napoleon's failure to develop a similar credit infrastructure meant that his empire was always one major loss away from total financial collapse. This disparity in financial engineering was the silent variable that determined the outcome of the Napoleonic Wars long before the final shots were fired. To counter this surge in coalition strength, Napoleon was forced to resort to desperate measures to replenish his ranks. He called up the Marie-Louises, a class of teenage conscripts who lacked the training and physical resilience of the veterans lost in Russia. This was a significant downgrade in human capital quality, as these raw recruits were often more of a liability than an asset on the battlefield. The French state was essentially attempting to mask its insolvency by flooding the market with low-quality labor. These boys were expected to perform at the same level as the seasoned professionals who had conquered Europe, but the lack of institutional support made this impossible. Napoleon's overhead costs remained high, but the productivity of his new army was at an all-time low. This mismatch between operational requirements and labor capacity was a recipe for a total organizational breakdown. The 1815 campaign, culminating at Waterloo, was the final bankruptcy filing for the Napoleonic experiment. After his return from exile, Napoleon attempted one last high-stakes merger to restore his previous market share. However, the coalition forces were no longer the fragmented subsidiaries he had easily defeated a decade earlier. They had adopted his own organizational structures and were backed by the inexhaustible credit of the British banking system. Waterloo was not just a battle of musketry and bayonets. It was the moment the market finally called in all of Napoleon's outstanding debts. The French army's collapse on the field represented a total loss of investor confidence in the emperor's ability to deliver a return. When the smoke cleared, the French Empire was effectively liquidated, its assets seized, and its CEO permanently removed from board. The ultimate winner of this 20-year trade war was not a general or a king, but the City of London. By outlasting Napoleon's protectionist blockade, the British had secured a monopoly on global trade that would last for the next century. The pound sterling became the global reserve currency, the gold standard by which all other values were measured. The British had successfully performed a hostile takeover of the entire global economic system, using their naval and financial leverage to dictate the terms of international commerce. Napoleon's mistake was believing that military force could override the basic incentives of buyers and sellers across the continent. He failed to see that a nation of shopkeepers is far more dangerous than a nation of soldiers when they hold the keys to the credit market. In the end, the French Empire was dismantled not by the sword, but by the cold, calculating logic of the invisible hand.